My name is Hattie, and I'm 58 years old. I raised my son Derek alone after losing my husband when Derek was just 12. I sacrificed everything to give that boy a good life, working double shifts as a nurse while he grew up. We were best friends, or so I thought, until he married Jessica. She came from money, had fancy degrees, and from day one, she made it clear I didn't belong in their world. At Derek's 35th birthday party last week, she said something that shattered my heart into a million pieces. She told everyone I wasn't real family. But here's the thing about people like Jessica. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that'll make you think twice about family. Because just 3 days after humiliating me in front of everyone, Jessica showed up at my door with tears streaming down her face, begging for something only I could give her. You know, losing my husband Robert when Derek was in 7th grade changed everything about our lives. One day we were a complete family. The next day, I was a single mother trying to figure out how to pay the mortgage and raise a teenage boy. Those were dark times, I won't lie. I worked every extra shift the hospital would give me, sometimes pulling 16-hour days just to make ends meet. But Derek and I, we made it work. We had our traditions, our inside jokes, our Sunday morning pancakes that turned into afternoon conversations about everything under the sun. Derek was such a good kid. He never complained about wearing hand-me-down clothes or eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner when money was tight. Instead, he'd help me balance the checkbook and remind me to take my vitamins. When he got into college on a partial scholarship, I was so proud I cried for 3 days straight. I worked extra shifts to help with what the scholarship didn't cover, and when he graduated with honors in marketing, I felt like all those sacrifices had been worth it. After college, Derek moved to the city for his career. He called me every Sunday without fail, visited twice a month, and always made me feel like I was still the most important woman in his life. He'd bring me little gifts from his business trips and tell me stories about his coworkers and clients. We'd watch old movies together, and he'd laugh at my terrible jokes, just like when he was little. Then he met Jessica at a networking event. She worked for some high-end consulting firm downtown, had her MBA from Wharton, and came from old Connecticut money. Her father owned 3 car dealerships, and her mother sat on charity boards. When Derek first told me about her, I was excited. My son deserved happiness, and if this woman made him smile the way he did when he talked about her, then I was ready to welcome her with open arms. But from the moment I met Jessica, something felt off. She had this way of looking at me like I was a problem that needed solving. When Derek brought her to my modest little house for Sunday dinner, she spent the entire time suggesting improvements I could make if I just hired the right contractors. She corrected my grammar mid-sentence and explained why organic vegetables were worth the extra cost, as if I'd never thought about nutrition before. The worst part was watching Derek change around her. My confident, funny son started second-guessing himself. He'd look to Jessica for approval before answering simple questions, and he stopped telling his silly stories because she'd point out logical inconsistencies. When I'd call during the week, Jessica would often answer his phone and explain that Derek was too busy with important work calls to chat. As their relationship got more serious, the visits became less frequent. Derek would cancel our Sunday dinners because Jessica had made other plans for them. When I'd suggest getting together, he'd say they had couples commitments or social events I wouldn't enjoy. Slowly but surely, I felt myself being pushed to the margins of my son's life. The engagement happened without me knowing it was coming. Derek called to tell me the news after Jessica had already posted it on social media. When I asked if I could help with wedding planning, Jessica politely explained that her mother had everything under control. I wasn't included in dress shopping, venue selection, or menu tasting. My role was to show up, smile, and write a check for whatever they needed. The wedding itself was beautiful, but cold. Jessica's family filled most of the guest list, while my side of the church looked practically empty. I'd invited my nursing colleagues and a few neighbors, but Jessica had somehow forgotten to send them invitations until the last minute. My table was placed in the back corner, far from the head table, where Derek and Jessica sat with her family and college friends. During the reception, I barely got 5 minutes alone with my son. Every time I approached, Jessica would appear with someone important he absolutely had to meet. When I finally got a moment to tell Derek how proud I was of him, Jessica interrupted to announce it was time for photos with the bridal party. I wasn't in a single family photo, except for one awkward shot of the three of us that looked more like a business handshake than a family moment. After the wedding, the distance between Derek and me grew wider. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I'd suggest lunch dates, Derek would say he needed to check with Jessica first. More often than not, she'd already made plans for them. I started to feel like I needed permission from my daughter-in-law just to spend time with my own son. 6 months into their marriage, Derek and Jessica bought a massive house in Westfield, one of those sprawling colonials with circular driveways and 3-car garages. The mortgage payment was more than my annual salary, but Jessica assured everyone that Derek's career was on a fast track and money would never be an issue. She quit her consulting job to focus on decorating their new home and planning their social calendar. The house became another barrier between us. It was 30 minutes further from my place, and Jessica always seemed to have contractors or dinner parties or important phone calls whenever I suggested visiting. When I did get invited over, usually for major holidays, Jessica would give me tours pointing out all the expensive details I clearly couldn't appreciate. The marble countertops from Italy, the custom millwork, the designer furniture that cost more than my car. I started noticing that Derek looked tired during these visits. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. When I'd ask if everything was okay, Jessica would answer for him, explaining how stressful his new promotion was and how busy their social calendar had become. Derek would just nod along, barely making eye contact with me. The phone calls stopped coming entirely after their first anniversary. When I'd call Derek's cell, Jessica would answer and explain that he was in meetings or traveling for work. She'd promised to have him call back, but he never did. I started leaving voicemails, but they went unanswered. It was like my son had disappeared from my life completely. I tried reaching out through social media, but Jessica managed all their accounts. Their posts showed constant dinner parties, weekend trips to the Hamptons, and photos of their perfect life together. There was never any mention of family, never any pictures that included me. It was as if I'd been erased from Derek's history. The final straw came when I decided to drop by unannounced with Derek's favorite chocolate chip cookies. I'd been baking them the same way since he was 7 years old, and he used to say they were better than anything you could buy in stores. When I rang the doorbell, Jessica answered in her tennis outfit, clearly irritated by the interruption. She took the cookies with a forced smile and explained that Derek was at the gym, though his car was clearly in the driveway. When I asked if I could wait, she said they had dinner reservations and suggested I call next time. As I walked back to my car, I saw Derek watching from an upstairs window. When our eyes met, he quickly stepped back and closed the curtains. Derek's 35th birthday party was supposed to be my chance to reconnect with my son. The invitation came through email, not a personal call, and it was addressed to a general mailing list. I wasn't involved in planning it, choosing the menu, or even asked what kind of gift Derek might want. But I was determined to make it special anyway. I spent an entire week creating a photo album that chronicled Derek's life from birth to his wedding day. I included pictures of his first steps, his Little League games, high school graduation, college adventures, and our special moments together. Each photo had a little note from me sharing the memory behind it and telling him how proud I was of the man he'd become. It was my way of reminding him of our bond and showing Jessica that I'd been there for every important moment of his life. The party was held at their house, and by the time I arrived, the place was packed with people I didn't recognize. Jessica's friends from her charity boards, Derek's new work colleagues, neighbors from their exclusive development. Everyone was dressed like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog, and I felt underdressed in my department store dress and costume jewelry. Derek greeted me with a quick hug, but Jessica immediately pulled him away to meet some important client who'd just arrived. I spent the first hour wandering around their house, making small talk with people who clearly had no idea who I was. When someone would ask how I knew Derek, I'd say I was his mother, and they'd look surprised as if they'd never heard him mention having a mother. The worst part was watching Derek play the perfect host while completely ignoring me. He'd laugh at Jessica's stories posed for photos with her friends and charm everyone with his wit and intelligence. But whenever I'd try to join a conversation, the group would somehow shift away from me, leaving me standing alone with my glass of wine and my carefully chosen gift. When it came time for presents, Derek opened gift after expensive gift from their wealthy friends. golf club memberships, weekend getaways, designer accessories that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Each gift came with elaborate explanations about why Derek deserved the best of everything and how successful he'd become. Finally, it was my turn. I handed him the photo album with trembling hands, explaining that I'd put together some memories from his life. Derek smiled politely and flipped through a few pages, but before he could really look at it, Jessica made some comment about how thoughtful homemade gifts were and quickly moved on to the next present. That's when someone asked about family, wondering if Derek's relatives lived nearby. Jessica's response hit me like a physical blow. She laughed that perfect social laugh she'd mastered and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, Derek and I are each other's real family now. Some people just don't understand that when you get married, your spouse becomes your priority, not your extended family." The words hung in the air like poison. Extended family. As if I was some distant relative instead of the woman who'd raised Derek from birth, who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, who'd loved him unconditionally for 35 years. Everyone in the room understood exactly what Jessica meant, and they all looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. I waited for Derek to say something, anything, to defend me or correct his wife's cruel words, but he just stood there looking uncomfortable, saying nothing. My own son, the boy I'd raised to stand up for what was right, said absolutely nothing, while his wife publicly humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but really I just needed to cry where no one could see me. When I came back downstairs, the party had moved on like nothing had happened. I placed my gift on the table with all the others and quietly let myself out through the front door. No one followed me. No one said goodbye. No one even noticed I was gone. The next 3 days were the darkest I'd experienced since losing my husband. I couldn't stop replaying Jessica's words in my head, the way she'd dismissed me so casually, the way Derek had just stood there and let it happen. I kept thinking about all the nights I'd worked late, so Derek could have new school clothes, all the times I'd chosen between paying bills and buying groceries so he could go on field trips with his classmates. I pulled out old photo albums and looked through pictures of Derek and me together. His first day of school, when he was so nervous, he cried until I promised to pack an extra cookie in his lunch. His 8th grade graduation, when he thanked me in his speech for being the best mom in the world. Prom night, when he told me I was more beautiful than any of the other mothers. How had we gone from that closeness to this painful distance? The hurt was so deep I could barely function. I called in sick to work something I'd never done unless I was actually running a fever. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything except the betrayal I felt. My own son had chosen his wife's cruelty over his mother's love, and I couldn't understand how I'd raised someone who could be so callous. But by the 3rd day, hurt started turning into something else. Anger. And then surprisingly, clarity. I realized I'd been enabling this treatment by always being available, always forgiving, always making excuses for Derek's behavior. I'd taught him that my love was unconditional, which he'd interpreted to mean my respect was optional. I made a decision that went against every maternal instinct I had. I wasn't going to call Derek anymore. I wasn't going to text him, invite him to dinner, or try to insert myself into his life. If my son wanted a relationship with his mother, he was going to have to initiate it. I was done chasing after someone who clearly didn't value what I brought to his life. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but I knew it was the right one. I started filling my time with activities I'd neglected while trying to maintain a relationship with Derek. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking yoga classes at the community center, and reconnected with nursing colleagues I'd lost touch with over the years. The silence from Derek was deafening but not surprising. No phone calls, no text messages, no acknowledgement that anything had changed between us. It confirmed what I'd suspected, that Jessica had successfully convinced my son that his mother was unnecessary baggage from his past. The thought broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve to build a life that didn't depend on his approval or attention. I was learning to be happy again, rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of trying to be the perfect mother to an increasingly distant son. It wasn't easy, but every day got a little bit better. I was finally putting myself first, and it felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. 3 days after Derek's birthday party, at exactly 8:15 on a Wednesday evening, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. I was settling in with a cup of tea and a good book, enjoying the peace I'd found in my new routine. But the bell rang again more insistently this time, followed by urgent knocking. When I opened the door, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Jessica stood on my front porch, and she looked absolutely terrible. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup was smeared from crying, and she was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. This was not the polished, controlled woman I'd come to know. This was someone in complete crisis. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to talk to you. Please, it's about Derek." My heart immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. Had something happened to my son? Was he hurt in the hospital worse? Despite everything that had happened between us, Derek was still my child, and maternal instinct kicked in immediately. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping aside to let her in. "Is Derek okay?" Jessica collapsed onto my couch and started crying harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. Between sobs, she started telling me a story that made my head spin. Derek had lost his job 2 months ago. Not just any job loss, but a termination for cause after a major client complained about his work performance. The company had escorted him out of the building the same day, and he'd been unemployed ever since. But instead of reaching out for help or support, Derek and Jessica had decided to hide the truth from everyone. They'd been living off credit cards and savings, pretending everything was fine, while their financial situation spiraled out of control. The massive mortgage payments, the car loans, the credit card bills from maintaining their expensive lifestyle had finally caught up with them. "The bank sent the foreclosure notice yesterday," Jessica said through her tears. "We have 30 days to bring the mortgage current, or they're taking the house. Derek's been applying for jobs, but nothing's come through yet. We've maxed out all our credit cards just trying to buy time." I sat there in stunned silence processing this information. While I'd been grieving the loss of my relationship with Derek, he'd been going through the biggest crisis of his adult life. And instead of turning to his mother, the one person who'd always been there for him, he'd chosen to struggle in silence rather than admit he needed help. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Jessica looked up at me with desperate eyes. "We need someone to co-sign for a loan to save the house. Someone with good credit and steady income. Someone with collateral." She paused, wiping her nose with a tissue. "Derek's name is ruined in the financial world right now because of the job situation. The bank won't approve anything with just his signature." And there it was. The woman who'd spent 2 years pushing me out of Derek's life, who'd publicly humiliated me 3 days earlier by saying I wasn't real family, was now sitting in my living room begging for my financial help. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. "So now I'm family?" I asked quietly. Jessica had the decency to look ashamed. "I know I've treated you terribly. I know I said awful things. But Derek is falling apart, and I don't know what else to do. You're the only person who loves him enough to help us, and you're the only person with the financial stability to qualify as a co-signer." Just then, I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Derek walking toward my house. He looked terrible, even worse than Jessica. He'd lost at least 20 pounds, his clothes hung loose on his frame, and he walked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Derek knocked softly on my front door, and when I opened it, he looked at me with the same expression he'd had as a little boy when he'd broken something valuable and had to confess. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around me and hugged me tighter than he had in years. I felt his whole body shaking, and I knew he was crying. "Mom," he whispered against my shoulder, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I led him into the kitchen, the same place where we'd had countless heart-to-heart conversations throughout his childhood. Jessica stayed in the living room, giving us privacy for what we both knew would be a difficult conversation. I made Derek sit at the kitchen table while I put the kettle on, falling back into the familiar rhythm of taking care of my son. "Tell me everything," I said, sitting across from him with 2 cups of tea. Derek's story came out in broken pieces, interrupted by tears and long pauses where he struggled to find words. He told me about the client meeting that had gone so wrong, how he'd misunderstood their needs and proposed a strategy that cost them thousands of dollars. He explained how his boss had been looking for reasons to downsize the department, and Derek's mistake had given him the perfect excuse. But the worst part was what came next. Derek admitted that he'd been so afraid of disappointing Jessica, so worried about maintaining their lifestyle and social status, that he'd decided to hide the job loss from everyone. He'd been leaving the house every morning as if he was going to work, spending his days at coffee shops and libraries, applying for jobs on his laptop. Jessica kept planning expensive dinners and weekend trips. Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. She kept buying things for the house, talking about the Christmas party she wanted to host. I didn't know how to tell her that we couldn't afford any of it anymore. When Jessica finally discovered the truth, it was because a former colleague had mentioned Derek's termination at a social event. She'd confronted him that night, and Derek had been forced to reveal the extent of their financial problems. The credit cards were maxed out, their savings was gone, and they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. "I wanted to call you," Derek said, looking directly into my eyes. "Every single day I wanted to pick up the phone and tell you what was happening. But Jessica said it would be embarrassing, that it would make us look like failures. She said we needed to handle it ourselves like adults." I felt my anger rising, but not at Derek. At Jessica for isolating my son from his support system. At the situation that had driven such a wedge between us. But mostly at myself for not fighting harder to maintain our relationship. "And now?" I asked. Derek broke down completely. "Now I realize that I've been an idiot. That I let Jessica convince me that needing help from my mother was some kind of weakness. That I've treated the most important person in my life like garbage because I was too proud and too stupid to see what was happening." He told me about the foreclosure notice, about the desperate job applications that weren't leading anywhere, about the mounting bills and the sleepless nights. He told me about how Jessica had finally admitted that she'd been wrong, that they needed family more than they needed pride. "But I don't just want your money, Mom," Derek said, reaching across the table to take my hands. "I want my mother back. I want our Sunday dinners and our phone calls and our silly conversations about nothing. I want to stop pretending that Jessica's approval matters more than your love." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I also saw a man who'd made terrible choices and hurt me deeply, but who was finally ready to acknowledge his mistakes and make changes. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," I told him. "If I help you financially, there are going to be conditions. And Jessica is going to have to make some serious changes too." Derek nodded eagerly. "Anything. Whatever you need." I took a deep breath and laid out my terms. If I was going to risk my financial security to save their house, Jessica was going to have to publicly acknowledge her treatment of me and apologize for it. Not just to me privately, but to everyone who'd witnessed her behavior at the birthday party. She was going to have to post on social media admitting that she'd been wrong and asking for forgiveness. "And we're going to have regular family dinners," I continued. "Once a week at my house, just the 3 of us. No phones, no interruptions, no excuses. If you want me to be part of your financial solution, I'm going to be part of your family again." Derek agreed immediately, but I knew the real test would be getting Jessica to accept these terms. When we returned to the living room, I laid out my conditions clearly and calmly. Jessica's first instinct was to argue, to suggest that a private apology would be sufficient, that social media was too public for such personal matters. "Those are my terms," I said firmly. "Take them or leave them. You made our family business public when you humiliated me in front of all those people. If you want my help, you'll make your apology just as public." The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. Derek called me the following evening to say that Jessica had agreed to my terms. She would post a public apology on social media and commit to rebuilding our family relationship. In exchange, I would co-sign for a loan that would save their house and give Derek time to find new employment. That weekend, Jessica posted a video on her Facebook page. It was awkward and clearly difficult for her, but she looked directly into the camera and apologized for her treatment of me. She admitted that she'd been wrong to try to separate Derek from his mother, that she'd said hurtful things at the birthday party, and that she was committed to making amends. The video got dozens of comments from people who'd witnessed her behavior, and most of them were supportive of her willingness to admit her mistakes. The following Monday, we met at the bank to sign the loan papers. I was putting my house up as collateral, which meant that if Derek and Jessica defaulted, I could lose everything I'd worked for. But I also knew that Derek was a good man who'd lost his way, and that giving him this second chance was the right thing to do. The legal paperwork included clauses that protected my interests. If Derek and Jessica returned to their old patterns of excluding me from their lives, I had the right to demand immediate repayment of the loan. If they missed more than 2 mortgage payments without communicating with me first, I could take legal action to protect my investment. Over the next few months, our family slowly began to heal. Derek found a new job with a smaller company that paid less than his previous position, but he was grateful for the opportunity to rebuild his career. Jessica got a part-time job as well, contributing to their income and learning to appreciate the value of hard work. Our weekly dinners became the highlight of my week. We'd cook together, sharing stories about our days and rebuilding the closeness that had been damaged. Jessica gradually opened up about her own insecurities, admitting that she'd felt threatened by my close relationship with Derek and had tried to compete with me instead of embracing me as family. Derek lost the pretentious attitude he'd developed during his high-earning years. He was more like the son I'd raised, humble and grateful, and focused on what really mattered. He told me stories about his new coworkers, asked for advice about career decisions, and started calling me just to chat like he had when he was younger. The financial arrangement worked out exactly as planned. Derek and Jessica made their payments on time every month, rebuilt their credit, and eventually qualified for a refinanced mortgage that removed me from the loan. When the papers were signed and my financial risk was eliminated, Derek insisted on taking me out to celebrate. "You saved us," he said over dinner that night. "Not just financially, but as a family. I almost lost the most important relationship in my life because I was too proud to admit I needed my mother." Jessica had changed too, though it took time for me to fully trust her transformation. She started asking for my advice about decorating projects, invited me to social events, and made genuine efforts to include me in their lives. When she got promoted at her new job, I was one of the first people she called with the good news. The experience taught all of us valuable lessons about family pride and the importance of maintaining relationships even when they're difficult. I learned that sometimes you have to be willing to set firm boundaries to get the respect you deserve. Derek learned that independence doesn't mean cutting ties with the people who love you most. And Jessica learned that families are strengthened by inclusion, not exclusion. Looking back now, I'm almost grateful for the crisis that brought us back together. If Derek hadn't lost his job, if they hadn't faced foreclosure, we might have continued drifting apart until there was nothing left to salvage. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what really matters, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need our love the most. I want to leave you with this thought. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're not worthy of love and respect, especially from your own family. And remember that sometimes the biggest crises in our lives are actually opportunities for our relationships to become stronger than they ever were before. What matters isn't that we never make mistakes, but that we're willing to admit when we're wrong and work to make things right. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who took your love for granted? Let me know in the comments below what you think about Jessica's behavior and whether you believe people can really change. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family forgiveness and finding your way back to what matters most. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to rebuild broken relationships. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope your own family bonds grow stronger with each passing day.